Every single day for 12 years, a man walked out of KGB headquarters carrying in his shoes handwritten notes about the most secret operations the Soviet Union had ever conducted. Nobody suspected him, not once. He was not a spy. His name was Vasili Mitrokhin. The FBI would later call what he carried the most complete and extensive intelligence ever received from any source in history. In a small dacha outside Moscow, he hid the typed pages in tins and milk containers buried under the floorboards. In 1992, he offered it to the Americans. They turned him away. March 1992. Moscow. A man boards an overnight train. He is 70 years old. He carries a suitcase that appears to contain clothes. He has the unremarkable appearance of an elderly Soviet bureaucrat, which is technically what he is, a retired archivist from the KGB's first chief directorate, the foreign intelligence arm of the organization that ran Soviet espionage for 70 years. He retired in 1984. He is nobody. The train to Latvia is not suspicious. Retired people travel. There is nothing about him that would cause a border guard to look twice. What the border guards do not know, what the KGB does not know, what nobody outside a very small circle suspects, is what else this man is carrying. Not in the suitcase, hidden elsewhere, in ways that the official account has never fully specified. In his shoes, in the lining of his coat, distributed across his person in the careful way of someone who has spent years thinking about this moment. Handwritten notes, thousands of pages of handwritten notes copied over 12 years from the most secret files in the KGB's archive, summarizing operations that the Soviet Union had run across 6 decades and every continent on Earth. His name is Vasili Mitrokhin, and what he is carrying out of Russia is, in the assessment of the FBI, which will eventually get access to it, the most complete and extensive intelligence ever received from any source in the history of American espionage. He arrived in Latvia. He went to the American embassy in Riga. He told them what he had. He showed them samples. They turned him away. Probably fakes, they said. Come back later. He walked to the British embassy. A young diplomat offered him a cup of tea. She was fluent in Russian. She listened. She called MI6. What happened next changed everything. The Western world thought it knew about what the KGB had done to it. Vasili Mitrokhin was born in 1922 in rural Russia, the son of a decorator. He served in the Second World War, worked briefly in a prosecutor's office in Ukraine, and entered the MGB, the predecessor to the KGB, in 1948 as a foreign intelligence officer. He was not a great spy. His early career included a posting to Australia in 1956 for the Olympic Games, but by his own account, he was ineffective in operational work. And after what he described as a mishandled assignment, he was moved from field operations to the archives. It was, from the KGB's perspective, a demotion. It was, in retrospect, the most consequential personnel decision in the history of Soviet intelligence. In the archives, Mitrokhin had access to everything. Not the physical documents, he was an archivist, not an analyst, but the summaries, the indexes, the operational files that described what the KGB had done and was doing across the world. He read the files of agents recruited in Western universities in the 1930s. He read the operational records of the Cambridge Five, Burgess, Maclean, Philby, Blunt, Cairncross, the British intelligence officers who had passed secrets to Moscow for decades. He read about operations in the United States, in Western Europe, in Africa, in Latin America. He read about assassination plots. about active measures campaigns designed to destabilize Western democracies, about the theft of nuclear and military technology, about agents who had never been caught and were still in place. And he began to be horrified. Mitrokhin himself dated the beginning of his disillusionment to Khrushchev's 1956 speech to the Communist Party Congress denouncing Stalin. The speech in which the Soviet leadership officially acknowledged, for the first time, the scale of Stalin's crimes. Mitrokhin read the speech and then went back to the files and saw, in specific operational detail, what those crimes had looked like at the KGB level. The mechanics of state murder, the operations against ordinary Soviet citizens, the systematic destruction of people for reasons that had nothing to do with any genuine threat to the state. He later told the historian Christopher Andrew, who would co-author the books based on his archive, "I could not believe such evil. It was all planned, prepared, thought out in advance. It was a terrible shock when I read things." He kept reading, and he kept notes. In 1972, Mitrokhin was given a new assignment that would consume the next 12 years of his life and produce the most valuable intelligence windfall in the history of the Cold War. The KGB's first chief directorate was moving its archive from the Lubyanka, the famous Moscow building that had been the headquarters of Soviet intelligence since the 1920s, to a new facility at Yasenevo in the suburbs. Mitrokhin was put in charge of supervising the move. He had access to 300,000 files. For 12 years, he read the files. He took notes on everything: operational details, names of agents, methods, locations of buried weapons caches, the identities of sleeper agents in Western countries, people living under false names who could be activated in the event of war, the methods by which the KGB had penetrated Western intelligence services, the full scope of Soviet active measures, the disinformation campaigns, the forgeries, the manipulation of foreign political parties and media organizations. He wrote the notes by hand. He hid them in his shoes each evening when he left the building. He took them home and typed them up. He hid the typed pages in tins and milk containers buried under the floorboards of his dacha, his country house outside Moscow. Then he went back to the Lubyanka the next morning and read more files. Every day for 12 years, he walked out of KGB headquarters carrying handwritten notes about the most secret operations the Soviet Union had ever conducted. Every day for 12 years, the consequence of being caught was arrest, a secret trial, and almost certain execution. He was not caught. He was not even suspected. He was, to the KGB, an unremarkable elderly archivist doing his job. He retired in 1984. He had 6 trunks worth of notes hidden under his dacha. The Soviet Union still existed. The Cold War was still ongoing. He had nowhere to go and no way to get the archive out. He waited. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The borders opened. The security services that had made defection almost impossible for decades were suddenly distracted by institutional chaos, budget cuts, and the basic problem of figuring out what country they worked for. Mitrokhin had his window. He packed samples of his notes. He boarded the train to Latvia. He went to the American embassy in Riga and told them he was a former KGB archivist with access to decades of operational files. CIA officers at the embassy, dealing with hundreds of Russians trying to flee the collapsing Soviet Union, were not impressed. He was not a spy, just a librarian. The handwritten documents could have been fabricated. They told him to come back later and did not follow up. Later, in Washington, when the full value of the archive became clear and American intelligence officials were asked to explain why the CIA had turned Mitrokhin away, the explanations were technical and procedural. Standard skepticism about walk-ins, inability to verify the documents on the spot. The chaos of the period making careful assessment difficult. These explanations are plausible. They do not fully account for the fact that the Americans then ended up paying the British to exfiltrate Mitrokhin, footing the bill for the operation that extracted the defector they had turned down, in exchange for access to material they had initially dismissed as probable fakes. The British diplomat who had received Mitrokhin at the embassy, a young woman whose name has not been made public, saw something in him that the Americans had missed. She arranged for MI6 officers to meet him. The MI6 officers recognized immediately what they were looking at. They arranged an exfiltration. In September 1992, Mitrokhin, his family, and the archive arrived in Britain. 6 trunks of handwritten notes, representing 12 years of daily risk and the most comprehensive account of KGB foreign operations ever assembled, were now in the hands of Western intelligence. The British kept the secret for 7 years. The intelligence derived from Mitrokhin's archive was put to immediate use. Names of agents were cross-referenced with existing files. Investigations were opened. Operations were neutralized. The archive contained the identities of KGB agents across Europe, North America, Latin America, Africa, and Asia, some still active, some long dormant, all previously unknown to Western intelligence services. In Britain, the name that received the most attention when the archive's existence was finally made public in 1999 was Melita Norwood. She was 87 years old at the time. She lived in a suburb of London. She had been the KGB's longest-serving agent in Britain, 40 years of passing information about the British nuclear program to Moscow, recruited in the 1930s and never detected. When MI6 learned her identity from Mitrokhin's notes in 1992, they chose not to prosecute. She was too old, the information too dated, the public value of a prosecution too uncertain. She lived quietly in her house until she died in 2005, 13 years after she was identified, and 7 years after the world learned she had been a Soviet spy. The revelations of what Mitrokhin had documented were staggering in their scope. More than half of Soviet weapons systems had been built from designs stolen from American defense contractors. The KGB had tapped the telephones of American officials, including Henry Kissinger. Soviet agents had penetrated almost every major Western defense company. KGB active measures campaigns had planted forged documents, promoted assassination conspiracy theories about American political figures, and funded political organizations across Europe designed to advance Soviet interests without their members knowing the source of the money. The archive documented Operation Ryan, the Soviet intelligence program we discussed in our episode about Able Archer 83, the program designed to detect the first signs of an American nuclear attack. It documented the KGB's operations in Cuba before and during the missile crisis. It documented Soviet penetration of Western intelligence services, including the CIA and MI6 themselves, in detail that allowed Western counterintelligence to re-examine decades of operations with new clarity about which had been compromised. It also documented something more fundamental, the sheer scale of what the KGB had been and what it had done. Not a spy agency in the conventional sense, conducting targeted operations against specific adversaries, but a total apparatus of ideological warfare operating on every continent, in every sector, against every institution of Western society that might threaten Soviet power. Universities, trade unions, political parties, churches, the media. The KGB had not merely collected intelligence about these institutions, it had worked systematically to infiltrate and manipulate them over decades, in ways that Western societies had been almost entirely unaware of. Mitrokhin spent the last 12 years of his life in Britain. he worked with the historian Christopher Andrew on 2 books based on the archive. The Mitrokhin Archive, published in 1999, and the Mitrokhin Archive II, published in 2005 shortly after his death. The books caused the international sensation that Mitrokhin had always hoped they would. Agents were exposed across Europe. Parliamentary commissions were convened. Intelligence services that had been dismissing the scale of Soviet penetration for decades were forced to confront what the files showed. Mitrokhin made one condition when he defected, one condition, non-negotiable, that he stated to MI6 from the beginning and that MI6 agreed to honor. The archive must be made public, not kept secret indefinitely as a tool of intelligence gathering, not classified and buried in files that no one would ever see. Made public, as a record for the Russian people and as a warning to future generations. The books were the public version. The fuller archive, the typescript notes that Mitrokhin himself had organized, was placed at the Churchill Archives Center at Cambridge University after his death, alongside the papers of Winston Churchill and Margaret Thatcher. It opened to researchers in 2014. Some sections have since been closed again due to privacy concerns. The original handwritten notes remain classified. Mitrokhin did not enjoy his life in Britain. He lived in fear of former KGB colleagues, a fear that was not irrational given what had happened to other defectors who had embarrassed the Russian intelligence services. He was an introvert, a private person, a man who had spent 30 years in an archive and who found the attention that came with publication unwelcome. The life he had imagined for himself in the West, if he had imagined one at all, did not match the reality of being a defector in middle age, in a country whose culture he did not fully understand. He died on January 23, 2004, at the age of 81. The KGB's successor organization, the SVR, had attempted after the books were published to discredit the archive by sending 2 apparent defectors to Western intelligence agencies who claimed that the SVR itself had orchestrated Mitrokhin's defection as a disinformation operation. The claim was false and was quickly identified as false. But it was a measure of how much damage the archive had done to Russian intelligence that the SVR felt the need to mount such an operation. What Mitrokhin's archive revealed, more than any specific operation or agent name, was the gap between what Western societies believed about their own security and what was actually true. The gap between the story Western governments told their citizens about how well they were protected from Soviet penetration and the reality that Soviet penetration had been far deeper, more systematic, and more sustained than anyone had publicly acknowledged. This gap was not comfortable to confront. It raised questions that intelligence services preferred not to answer about how decisions had been made, which operations had been compromised, which policies had been influenced by information the Soviets had stolen or by agents they had placed. The archive did not answer all of these questions. It raised them with specificity. Mitrokhin spent 12 years in a basement, alone with the most dangerous secrets in the world, copying them by hand and hiding them in his shoes. He did it not for money. He received relatively modest compensation for the archive. Not for adventure, he was by all accounts a shy and private man who found the experience of defection deeply uncomfortable. He did it because he read the files and was horrified, and because he believed that the horror should be on the record. He got his wish. The record exists. At Churchill College, Cambridge, in typescript volumes organized by country, alongside the papers of the men and women who led the Western Alliance through the decades when the KGB was running the operations Mitrokhin documented, his notes sit in folders that researchers can request and read. The KGB is gone. The Soviet Union is gone. The agents Mitrokhin named are mostly dead or very old. The operations he documented are history. But the archive is there. The record exists. The man who made it, who hid it in milk containers under the floor of his dacha for 20 years, while he waited for the moment to get it out, made sure of that. Thank you for being here for this story. Vasili Mitrokhin is one of the most consequential figures in the history of Cold War intelligence and one of the least known. The FBI called his archive the most complete and extensive intelligence ever received from any source. The CIA turned him away because he was just a librarian. The British diplomat who offered him a cup of tea changed the history of Western intelligence. Next week, we go to 1961 and a story that connects directly to the Berlin Wall episode we covered today. The man who might have given Kennedy advance warning of the wall's construction and changed the course of the crisis entirely. His name was Oleg Penkovsky. He was a colonel in Soviet military intelligence, and for 18 months, he passed to the CIA and MI6 the most valuable military intelligence of the entire Cold War, including the technical specifications of the Soviet missiles deployed in Cuba. Without Penkovsky, Kennedy might not have known that the missiles in Cuba were not yet operational. Without that knowledge, the Cuban Missile Crisis might have ended very differently. We will be there next week.